desires and display them for the world to see. No one would think you were odd for being the person you always wanted to be. There was no judgment for your choice of attire, and sometimes you were commended for that choice. Then, at the end of the night, you received a reward for your efforts with a bag full of candy. I'm far too old to go door to door begging for treats. I don't believe that. I don't. But I do enjoy watching my children do the same. Weeks in advance, we let them pick their costumes. They are far too young to delve into the ghastly and unusual and usually end up picking a character of a popular movie or TV show. They all do that. It's what their friends do. But I'm starting to question this tradition, especially after visiting 113 Forest Road. See, this past year we made the rounds of our local neighborhood. We made sure to only approach homes that had their porch light on, which was the unspoken, or always has been the unspoken rule. If your light's on, you can trick or treat. So there's this large, enormous house within our neighborhood, towering at 2 stories with all the other ones, which are only 1 level. It is enormous, black Victorian monstrosity that may have once been a beautiful place. However, the landscape had long needed work. It was the one voice beckoned them to wait. Trick or treat. Trick or treat. They said with excitement. Actually, they screamed with excitement. A feeling rolled into me like thunder, and a signal of danger raged in my heart. Something was not right. If they were home all this time, where was the car I had seen sitting in the driveway the last few weeks? I instinctively advanced on my two children, taking the steps in leaps. The feeling inside me was horrid and scared. It told me they should not go toward that voice. I called for them to stop as they turned towards the door. I choose both. The voice seemed strained, like that of a lifetime smoker. Two ragged hands shot from the parted pathway and drew both of my little boys inside. Their screams echoed in my heart. My adrenaline shot me forward, but my body slammed against a closing door. I pounded and pounded and pounded against the door repeatedly, screaming obscenities of every nature. My body was shaking violently as was a child. It was just me and my mother. We lived on a property owned by my grandmother, a 3-story old farmhouse, right in the fringe. Right in the fringe of the woods. It was far up the road, down a long, unlit gravel driveway. It felt isolated at night, being so distant from any other houses. Any other houses. Set in an area that had not been inhabited for 30 years before we started living in it. Quite often I was a fairly rambunctious child, so my mom went off to work. I would occasionally skip the morning bus to school and stay home all day long. The big house had a habit of feeling incredibly lonely and sparse. I spent most of my time playing in the forest expanse out back, some distance into the woods, far enough that I couldn't hear my mother when she called. There was a toppled tree. Actually, it was a pine tree which had crashed into another. An even larger trunk on its way down was now frozen there, forming a long arc over the forest floor. I loved to climb up the jagged stump at the base of the fallen tree, and then steady myself to a point just above the middle. I was never able to make it all the way to the top, because it just got, well, too steep for me to continue any further. And I had a bad habit of freaking out from how high up I was. And with nobody to call, I always had to figure it out myself. One day I was sitting in my usual spot on the fallen tree, which was a good distance from the ground, just listening to the birds singing and simultaneously feeling the warmth of the sun on my neck, when I heard something strange from underneath that paralyzed me in shock. A kid. I was gripped by a sudden strong surge of fear for a moment. The voice had come from directly underneath me. I strained my neck to look down, but I couldn't see anything over the ledge. For a long time I just sat there in absolute silence, as I was at the point where I was almost soon to convince myself that I had imagined hearing a man's voice at all. I know you can hear me. His voice was much louder this time as I yelled something out and scrambled up the log a little bit higher. Trembling nervously, I dug my fingernails into the bark and held tight for dear life. I sat there, trying to collect my nerves for God knows how long. Although I couldn't see it, the presence of the thing underneath me was still clear. The bird's song was much softer and more cautious this time, and when I listened closely, I swear I could hear the faintest echo of a human being breathing. So I gathered all my courage. I vowed to prove myself that it was all in my imagination by leaning over the ledge as far as I possibly could without slipping right off. Digging hard into the bark behind me, I stretched out along my arms and peered over, getting a full view of the empty forest floor and undergrowth when suddenly, "Come down here or I'll come up and grab you." It was so loud. His voice was as if he was screaming right in my face. I released my grip on the tree in fright and plunged off of the platform. I was saved only by a grabbing nearby Although this incident spooked both me and my mother, in time I somehow forgot about it, recovered. You know how kids do. Things don't seem so bad the longer time goes on. Exhibiting that naive, hard skin of a child. Although I never went as far into the forest as I used to, and I never again approached that fallen tree. Once when I was 12, I had the chore of taking firewood from the shed out back just at the edge of the woods and bringing it inside the house. I was exhausted by the time I was done, and I always chose to do it at dusk when the air was brimming with mosquitoes and a swampy fog that usually coated the lawn. By the time I had made my last round, I would sprint back to the house. Scared out of my wits, one of my least favorite things about this job was that the shed was full of barn owls. If you have ever seen a barn owl's face staring at you from a dark roof corner, then you know what I mean. One of these nights, it got mistier than it ever been before. A thick layer of fog covered everything and limited my line of sight to a short sphere around me. Even though the shed wasn't far from the house, I found myself feeling disoriented. More than once I walked in the wrong direction. How is this even possible? I don't know, even to this day. But both times I walked in different directions. I walked straight into those woods, and I have no idea why. By the time I'd reached my last load, it was too foggy to see the street. My eyes stung in the moisture, and it made my vision blur. Lurching forward, I managed to walk headfirst into a tree, doubling over and dropping all of the wood I'd collected. I was bundling onto my feet when I made a hard crunch. As I went to pick them up with my foot throbbing pretty hard, I realized that the ground was too misty for me to see my own knees. I decided to head to the house since we had more than enough wood for the night. However, it was getting to be pretty dark, and I couldn't even make out a single signifier of which direction I was heading in. It was the strangest feeling. Even though I cautiously walked for several feet in all directions trying to figure out my position in the mists, I still couldn't figure out any point of identification. I couldn't even locate the fence or the gate. And the more I walked, the more I seemed to stumble into trees, pine needles, mud crunching under my feet, instead of a dewy-covered lawn. After a while, I finally realized that I couldn't even find the shed anymore. Cursing myself for being so dumb while trying to ignore my thumping heart and sense that something else was at play, I became aware that I was lost somewhere in the fringe of the forest. Screaming out for my mother at the loudest possible volume was only met with a resounding silence from the depths of the mists all around from where I stood, affirming that I had wandered way too far from the house to be heard. A deep panic started to settle in on me. I noticed a glimpse of something pink, moving against a nearby pine trunk. Walking closer to it, I saw it was a ripped out square of pink paper. I noticed that this one was embedded with a long nail. It bore another arrow, like this one. But this time it didn't look like my mother's handwriting, and I knew it. I even knew it. As I read it, I began to freak out to cope, and I started to cry. It said in sloppy handwriting this way. My panic was now at a 10. I convinced myself that these notes were my only shot at making it home, but I knew it was not my mother's handwriting. I knew this. I was so desperate to get the hell out, and my brow was cold with sweat. I needed to get back before nightfall. I followed stupidly again the green arrow to a point where I could just dimly make out another spot of pink and an incline of collapsed stumps and leaf litter. At this point, it was getting pretty dark, and I had to strain both my eyes to see a few meters ahead of me, following the green arrows, feeling less and less sure of where exactly I was. I stumbled through the woods, groping out into the mist, like I was completely blind. I wanted to feel for trees, although I was terrified of something unseen grabbing me instead. I came across the third green note, which had another arrow pointing up again. This one it led to an increasingly steep slope that I didn't recognize, being anywhere near my house, and with a poorly drawn smiley face right above it. At this stage, I became frightened, terrified beyond belief. I knew this is not going to end well. I just started to cry as I slumped against the pine stump. The possibility that I would be out in these woods all night was beginning to sink in. I just sat there thinking about my mother. It was like a syringe being driven into the vein within my arm without my approval, and something horrific going into my bloodstream. I got a glimpse of another pink square in the near distance. I was squinting hard, unnerved by these notes, all of which looked freshly written, and without a sign of decay, despite the previous week's non-stop rain. So I knew whatever it was that was writing these was not far away. I read this one from afar. What I read made my blood turn cold. I stood to my knees, dead silently, wobbling on them in fear. My ears were sensitive to any tiny prickle of noise in the mist. For a long was my name. My name. It felt like I was running for hours, all the while the rain and the mist lapped at the back of my neck, like the decaying breath of someone running right behind me. Somehow I made it back to the house. All the lights were off, and I struggled to find the keys for a moment. When I found them, I bolted up indoors and quickly crawled into bed, where I remained unsleeping until morning. Mom just thought I'd come inside and gone to bed, and hadn't thought to leave the lights on. It was a miracle. Some freakish coincidence that I even found the house at all. But let me tell you about the final incident at that damn house. Witnessed only by my mother. Up until then, she had never experienced any of the strange things as I had. Although we mutually shared the peculiar oppressive quality that the house's interior had on us. And its placement in the dreary, imposing woods. Although I was obviously never a popular kid. By living way out in the country in the opposite direction from anyone at my school, it did not help. And it did not make some tight friendships in my first year of high school. One of these friends, Amanda, was her name. She invited me over one night, and I accepted. My mother drove me out to the place, which was about 3 miles away from. Then we drove back home. The night went well. We watched a horror movie, of course, devoured pizza, and probably smoked a little pot. My mom went home alone, where she intended to get some writing done. She worked for a magazine at that point. It was about midnight when I received an off-putting text from my mom in all caps. "Is this a damn prank? I need to know immediately." Thinking it was some kind of joke, I texted back, "Calm yourself, it's what a prank." Almost immediately to the response, "Are you at the house?" Of course, I responded, "No." Though I was thoroughly weirded out, I didn't receive another message until 3 a.m., when she told me that she was going to my grandparents in the morning and not by any means dare go home. I remember those blank, torrent, horrid rains of that day. I went to my grandmother's, and how terribly soaked I was when I finally got there. I was nearly 2 towns away. I had to fight the temptation to go home and drop off my bags. My mom's disturbing message from last night were enough of a warning not to do so. When I arrived, my mom and grandmother were there. All of the color had drained from their face, and she was slightly trembling. At one point, she even set a small glass crashing to the floor after flinching at the cat brushing around her ankles. It wasn't until later that night, when my grandmother was sound asleep, that she told me what happened. She went further as to forbid me from telling my old grandmother, out of the fear it would horrify her superstitious soul too much. So would you like to know what happened? On that night when I was at Amanda's, she described in lurid detail. My mother was sitting on the first story in the living room, where she sat on the couch by the fire, curtains open to the view of the sunset on the canopy, going over her latest draft. At first it was so faint that she barely noticed it. But after a while my mother became aware of it and vaguely irritated. Tiny thumping noises. Thumping, noises started to get sharper and louder that she paid more attention and saw that the rocks were being thrown at the window from the total blackness of the forest edge. She saw them appear from the shadows of the bush, and then fall in an arc and bounce out the window. Looking carefully, she could see small cracks from where some heavy ones had hit, right beside her head, where it had been moments before. Temporarily captivated, she tried to peer into the darkness enough to make out where the rocks were being thrown from. With a startled shock, she jumped back from the window as she saw me standing halfway between a tree, right near the window, grinning wide and staring at her. My one visible eye stretched wide open, showing all the white. She barely stifled a scream, seeing her own daughter standing there just staring and smiling. Not only did the figure not move or blink, it was standing by one of the nearest pines, far from where the rocks were shooting. That was terrifying. Up out of the bush as they continued to do so in a loud downpour, my face unceasingly continued to press out at her, smiling a weird, malicious, malevolent smile. Thinking this was all some sort of sick prank. Hence the text, my mother shouted my name at the top of her lungs, frightened to the core. However, instead of responding, the mouth of the thing that looked like me behind the tree just started moving, as if it were mouthing silent words really, really fast. Suddenly it turned its head to the side and seemed to be talking to someone else behind the tree. My mom said, who could not be seen. However, she was a formless black shape hanging against the other side of the tree. The girl that looked like me kept staring at my mother and doing the silent speed talking thing, then turning, and whispering to the thing next to her. Then she would turn back and start again, then breaking the monotonous spell. She suddenly pointed straight at my mother and started laughing. My mother screamed and fled to the bedroom on the second floor, the only room with the working lock. And she shut herself in and sat at the far end of the bed as the rocks began to pitter against the window downstairs, dry, heaving and weeping in fear. In my room, my mother said she did not feel safe. There was an awful smell, a weird humming noise in the walls, as she described it. She tried to pray for a long time before giving up and just listening to the rocks pelt against the walls and windows. Somewhere in the kitchen, she caught the distinct vibration sound of a window actually smashing, and the weird continuous humming from my room. Listening more carefully, she could identify it as a soft hint of a mumbling voice. In absolute horror, she recognized the voice, and then, virtually too afraid to look, she lifted her head up to the closet door, where an awful white face could be seen staring right at her, mouthing a contortion of weird words that she did not understand. I can't even imagine closet door was only a meter from my mother. It started to open slowly. In an unimaginable explosion of terror, she immediately bolted to the door, only to fumble with the lock as bigger and bigger rocks came crashing through the window, which burst apart in a spray of glass shards before they finally got out. Running out of the house, completely keeping her eyes off the woods, getting into her car and driving off, she said that she glanced back right at the end of the prolonged drive. She saw two unmistakable human forms standing at my broken bedroom window, watching her as her car got farther and farther away from our house. This would be their final farewell, as my mother never stepped foot in that place again. As my mother told this story and her experience, she started crying hysterically, tears just cascading down her cheeks. I never doubted her, and I still don't. I honestly and fully believe that she experienced what she said she did. It was also quite clear that we were done living in that house for once and for all. I did go back once with my dad, who I see very rarely nowadays. He came from another state to help us move. Mom had already found a place in town and moved in. She wouldn't go back. My dad and I just loaded up his truck with all that was left inside there. It was a silent, sunny morning when we removed all the stuff and emptied the place. I wish I could say there was some closure, some final spooking to cap it all off, but there wasn't. It was just a relief to be out of there. There are, however, two things left worth mentioning. Number one, when we checked the house for any signs of intruders, we found that several windows, including one in my bedroom and the one in the kitchen, had been smashed, and rocks were lying on the floor. Number two. Dad went out into the trees for a bit to take a leak. When he came back, he asked how long we'd had the swing set for. Needless to say, we'd never had a swing set. So, there you go. I was fairly unsettled to discover that in the week since we'd been gone, someone had assembled a rope swing set from one of the highest branches of the old pine over the ridge, against which was the fallen log I'd stopped climbing years ago. It was obviously new rope and a nicely polished, sanded down wood seat at the base. Dad wanted to keep my mind from recent events. He doubted the affair and thought my mother was mentally unstable, said that a neighbor probably set it up, not realizing it was our property. But there were no houses in at least a mile in any direction. So why would somebody walk a mile to build a swing? But I let it all go. Just had to say good riddance to the horrible place as we drove off for good. For the most part, I found it best to try and forget what happened at that place. But sometimes I just can't help but ponder it and wonder why. It's been so long enough that I no longer feel scared talking about it. And for a long while I couldn't say a word about it. Seeing as it was Halloween, what better time to share? My grandmother just recently sold the house to a new family, that being a young couple and their little son. Shortly after we moved out, despite my mother's desperate anxious about all of it now, although sometimes I can't help but let my imagination get the better of me. All I can do is think of that old house, the fallen down tree, the new occupants, and the swinging out back, gently spinning in the breeze as that little boy toddles, obviously, towards it. And I don't like when they don't leave an author. I guess this is found on 4chan. I guess it's Prozac 101 story. Okay. Prozac 101, okay. I may need some after these. These are pretty good. You know, sometimes you just don't know. Like, I never read this story. Before I read them to you, because I think it makes it more exciting. The Edge of Town. This was actually an entry for a contest in 2023, and the author is Bucket 28. Now, I've never read anything from them, so let's see. This will be story number 3, At the Edge of Town. First of all, I wanted to say that I feel like Halloween can be really scary for kids, and I'd have to agree with that, because two of actually Sienna's friends are terrified of Halloween, but I love it, we love it. So it can even be terrifying for adults as well, but it's not because of the costumes and decorations, it's because you're going out in the middle of the night, walking around far from home, talking to strangers, taking candy from them at every doorstep, trusting they have your best interest at heart. Of course, it was still a fun holiday that everyone would look forward to, but I really do think there was a common uneasiness deep beneath Halloween. When I was a child, I would get a weird feeling sometimes. I rarely got it, but when I did, I'd be playing outside, just going about my day, when I came across a path that I'd never seen before. Totally empty, and I couldn't tell where it led. I would suddenly realize that I'd wandered away from whoever was looking after me, and I was completely alone. For a brief moment, it was just me and this empty path in front of me, and that moment I would be completely overcome with emotions. I can't define it as positive or negative, just that it felt important and uneasy. Those moments always stuck with me, but I still don't know why. I'm only explaining this because it directly ties to what I'm about to describe. Back in elementary school, there was a popular story that kids would pass around in the week of Halloween. As the story goes, you shouldn't go out too long to trick or treat, because eventually you will reach something you're not meant to see, a road at the edge of town. It was never described in a consistent way, just that you'll know it when you see it. They say stormtrooper costume. I met with my next door neighbor, who was also my best friend at the time. Let's call him James. It's me, James, and 2 other friends from school. We went around the neighborhood hitting all the usual spots, and occasionally getting checked in on by my parents. Our biggest concern was making sure to visit the houses that always gave the best candy. After an hour or 2, we'd stopped at every house we knew, but being in the oldest grade of our elementary school, basically full-grown adults, we all felt confident enough to push our borders a bit. So after James called his parents to make sure they were cool with it, we checked out some new streets. From what I can remember, we found some good ones, but nothing that exciting, and definitely nothing relating to that fictional tale from school. About 30 minutes later, we were at the end of a cul-de-sac and everyone was getting pretty tired. We started talking about heading back. However, that's when I saw something weird. A gravel trail leading up a hill nearby. Normally, I would have wanted nothing to do with something like this, but I was suddenly overcome with curiosity. I don't know how to describe it. It's like I was in a trance. I asked my friends if they wanted to go check it out, but everyone felt too tired to walk up the hill. So against my better judgment, I told them I'd be back in a minute and made my way over. I reached the top of the hill, and that's when I saw it. The trail kept going, leading straight into the pitch black, dark woods. I got that same feeling, stronger than ever before, and in that moment I had every reason to turn back. But I just couldn't. I couldn't do it, and after all those moments I had, I guess I just couldn't take the curiosity anymore. I continued down the trail, following it as it twisted and turned deeper into the forest. You know, the weird thing is, I should have felt terrified. And terrified. I should have been. Something should have told me to stop. But I didn't. For some reasons, the presence of anything else on the trail never crossed my mind. It was never even a remote possibility. And I had no doubt in my mind that I was completely alone for such a pivotal moment. I felt like every detail should be burned into my head. But all I remember is the dead silence and the silhouettes of the trees against the night sky. Next thing I remember, I was back at the entrance. I must have gone in a full loop without realizing it. Whatever trance I was in faded away, and I made my way back down the hill. I expected to get an earful on how long I was gone, but my friends didn't say a word. We just went back, watched a movie together, and called it a night. There were some minor things that I could have sworn had changed, like the color of my carpet, the name of the neighborhood park, but even at the time I really chalked that up to my paranoia. However, thinking back on it now, I realize that was the same time when things started changing in my life. I don't want to get too personal, but I've dealt with a lot of things that I shouldn't have to have dealt with at that age. I often feel like nothing's ever been the same after that night. Not only that, but that was the last time I ever got that strange feeling. The very last time. I've never gotten it once, not one time. Not one time. I also never heard that same Halloween story place that none of us are from. Even if we can't remember it, we can all come here at some point walking down that same path. I'm trying not to get too hung up on about it. Whatever the case is, I'm here now and I might as well make the best of it. Because this is my life. But my suggestion to you all is to do the same. So please enjoy the season and every one of them after it. Happy Halloween. That was a good one. Very significant, because I think it's almost like a metaphor for things like when we're 13, 14, and our lives are changing, and then something happens, and it seems like when one bad thing happens, everything happens at once. Has anybody else experienced that? Story number 4. The Lonely Little Boy. Well, hello there. It's a beautiful time of the year, isn't it? Halloween. A time for candy, spooks, and horror and cheer. I love every second, every minute, hour, and day of it. Anywho, I have a story for you, little boys and girls. It's about a boy named Zane. He's a boy of muted speech, meaning he rarely speaks. His eyes are gray, sort of pigment, which makes him the odd one out. Different if you must. His hair is silver tinted, not shoulder, but just before his earlobe length. He was a little bit tall for his age, reaching about 4 feet 8 inches. But his weight was way below average. He was only 28 pounds. Our story starts off in a large-scale town known by the name of Jamestown. A very cliché name, no. Zane was considered strange in his town of outgoing and normal outlooks. He was shunned when he first tried making friends, like the local kids around in his home and other hangouts. Let's start out our story with Zane at the bus stop, going to school about 7:40 in the morning. As he stepped onto the bus, he observed the seats, looking for an open seat when he could sit next to someone, hoping to be accepted. As he stepped forward, a small little blonde by the name of Esmeralda moved her bag to the empty space next to her, exchanging a rather rude scowl to him. Zane continued down the alley of the bus, looking for another seat. Next was a rather big boy named Henry. Laid his feet into the empty space on his seat, laughing at Zane, speaking in a rude voice, stating, "This is a normal, kids-only seat, freak." Zane looked at him with an emotionless look as he shrugged and continued down the alley once more in search of a seat. He finally found a seat at the back of the bus. It was a one-person seat. Only one. And surprisingly, it was not occupied. He quickly set down his small, slightly ragged backpack on the ground as he took the seat. Noticing it was slightly uncomfortable, he stared out the window as the bus drove through the town. Finally reaching the school building, Jamestown Elementary, he stepped out and the kids scrambled ahead of him. He noticed relentlessly tortured him. They went from kicking him in PE to pinning him on the playground and stuffing his mouth with rocks, shoving his food tray in his face at lunch, to even catching him in the bathroom as they shoved his head into the urinals. Zane was a muted and usually civilized child. But one day a side of him emerged that he never had seen before. Love. Zane met a little girl named Mia. She was a short girl with dark hair that pressed her shoulders. Halfway down her back, her eyes glowed a shade of green that shone like a newly shined emerald. She was the kindest to Zane. Despite his features and muted nature, Mia and Zane spent a lot of time together. Mia talked to Zane about her pets, her parents, her favorite music and hobbies. She never minded his muted nature. In fact, she found it kind of cute. They even reached a point of friendship that they could be considered in love. They began to hold hands at lunchtime. Zane sat with her on the bus, and he even went over to her house once to play. Zane felt happiness, an emotion he thought was non-existent inside his mind. They both had a special area, the town park. It was on the southeast side of town. Mia and Zane would play there for hours as they sit under the big slide, playing games and just talking. He was a sort of loner. He didn't like to be around people, but with Mia, Zane felt sort of a closure, a paradise with her voice and eyes. One day when he spent the day at her home, she met him outside before he left. She smiled and hugged him, then kissed his cheek softly, which made Zane blush. He smiled as big as the moon in the midnight sky. She giggled at this and told him that she'd see him in school the next day. She ran back inside her home as he walked home, as happy as he'd ever been in a very, very long time. But the next day, Zane learned of another emotion, one of him that he would consider horrific, that would cause damage. Anger. Zane went to meet Mia at her house, as she usually did, but she never showed. He waited and waited and waited some more. There was no sign of her. She had just disappeared. He walked to school. Along the way, he saw her sitting on a bench at the bus stop with another boy. He looked to see who it was. He felt a searing pain cross his heart as he saw Henry sitting beside her, holding her hand, talking to her as if they were in deep love, deeper than she and Zane were. He walked over to them. Mia finally noticed him standing near. Zane felt tears well up in his, and he dropped his bag. Mia began to stand, but Henry laughed and stood up, walking to him, and he stood right in front of him, smirking at Zane's sorrow. He spoke with a very tough, purposely hurtful voice. "You thought she loved you, freak. She never loved you. She only hung out with you to make you feel better. The real thing here is that she loves me, not you, you skinny little freak of nature. You couldn't attract a girl unless she was blind, deaf, or just plain stupid." Zane heard this. He heard it well. His heart thumped hard. His head swirled with emotions. He noticed Mia was standing behind Henry, looking very guilty. He felt a warm sensation rise in his chest. His heart thumped faster and faster. His eyes began to open up as his breathing quickened. His hands balled up into a fist. Henry laughed some more as he knew, oh yes, he knew he was getting to Zane. However, he his vocal cords along with the left. Mia couldn't move. Fear struck her and kept her standing still. Zane finally reached arm's length of Mia as he held a finger up to her lips. Shh, Mia, he laughed some more maniacally. She began to weep in fear of what he would do. He stopped laughing, but his smirk remained. After a few seconds of complete silence, in the moment he spoke very softly in a whisper. Betrayer. The high punishment is death. After this, she screamed. He took a quick swing of his hand, whacking her in the side of the head with an inhuman force, silencing her scream. Her small body fell to the concrete, unconscious, also leaving a blood gash on the side of her head. He laughed hysterically as he observed his first victim and his heartbreaker. He grabbed the collar of Henry's shirt and lifted him over his shoulder. After this, he grabbed Mia's ankle, beginning to drag her unconscious body along as he walked down the concrete path to Shirley. What would be Mia's demise, as well as Zane's disappearance from this dreadful town? Mia and Henry's parents both called the police. No one found any trace for days, but soon enough, they checked the place they should have checked first. The bus stop. They spotted a trail of dried blood along the concrete sidewalk. This led to the park. What they found was a terrifying sight. Mia was strung up by her arms, both outstretched, if she was Jesus, on one of the crucifixes religious families hanging in their kitchen. Her eyes were closed, her arms and legs were cut. The cuts form words like liar, betrayer, and heartbreaker. One last gruesome detail was that of her chest. It was cut open. All of the organs seemed to be there except her heart. Her heart had been removed from her body. Instead, it was replaced by a balled-up piece of paper. When authorities opened it, it was a drawing of what seemed like a small child. The child had gray eyes, silver hair, and what seemed to be an almost demonic smile spread across his face, and his outstretched hands contained a drawing of a heart, protruding blood. Finally, at the top of this disturbing drawing was a sentence written in what seemed like blood. It read, "Love is a lie." Authorities were baffled, but the child and the dorm told them it was a boy named Zane. Same with the teachers. They never caught the little boy. His vengeance is brutal, but moral of the story: never betrays one's feelings. Never take more than what you need. One is enough. One is most definitely enough, kids. Written by Destroy, DEHSTOROI. That is pretty cool. That was pretty good. I wasn't really expecting that. That was a good one. Good one. Good one. I'd say, we have time for one more. What do you think? How about the Wicker House? The Wicker House, written by Shadow Swimmer 77, one of my favorite writers. He is very good. I may have read this, but I don't think so. Of course, everyone claiming residence in Arthur's Wake knows tales associated with the Wicker House. It seems that every small province plays host to some structure of ill repute which, as if supernatural magnetism, draws rumors of ghosts and boogies, wrapping by the timber and stone of the foundation in a shroud of darkness and horror. In Arthur's Wake, the Wicker House fills this odious task. Scant days after arriving in town, while taking the time to familiarize myself with the local watering hole and its residents, I became introduced to the well-known superstitions surrounding the Wicker House. As a man of science, I knew any truths to be found. Outlandish stories. They were likely embellished to points unrecognizable of the truth. Nothing was first-hand. All experiences were from a friend who knew a fellow who may have seen something. It is the provincial mind which transforms wild dogs into wolves, that walk like men and interprets astronomical phenomenon as harbingers of a certain doom. But still, my curiosity was sufficiently piqued. I endeavored to better inform myself upon the subject, though through more effective and objective means. To my great surprise, while failing to confirm the most supernatural claims of the tales, the town's records in the basement of the local library did provide aspects to a more sinister reality all their own. The house was built in 1920 by the millionaire Thomas Wicker, who, in addition to being both successful oil prospector and fishing magnate, was by all accounts completely insane. No one knows what first drew Wicker to Arthur's Wake. Some speculate this is the first outward sign of his impending madness. What is known, though, was the foundations of the house which would come to assume his name were poured almost immediately upon his arrival. The structure was supremely modest for a man of Wicker's means, rising a mere 2 stories in height, and composed of scarcely a dozen rooms of cellular and attic for storage. The house was built on Blackwood Drive, a major tributary of the town's main street, and close to the industrial center, such as it was. The plot itself considered a quarter acre. That's about it. The yard, home to a few blossoming trees and a small garden, the whole of which was surrounded by a high wrought iron fence, accessed by a similar gate. Posts of this formidable perimeter were adopted by wicked spikes to discourage would-be trespassers. Construction concluded rapidly in the autumn of 1920. Saw Wicker take up residence in the house, accompanied by a maid, groundsman, and his wife. The lady of the house quickly became the subject of gossip among the townsfolk. During the construction, Wicker had boarded his wife in parts unknown. None could recall when she arrived at the house. One day she was simply there. As a groundskeeper cared for the exterior yard and garden, and the maid handled all domestic chores, including trips to the market. The lady herself was never seen to have ever exited the house. Due to his complete lack of socialization, never seen to exit the house. Due to this complete lack of socialization, the townsfolk did not learn so much about the woman as her Christian name. The servants themselves shed no light upon the subject. The man hailed from a remote part of the dark continent, and the woman appeared to be mixed, vaguely of the Orient. Wicker had acquired the service of each while abroad for business dealings, and neither spoke a word of English. Naturally, the Lady Wicker was subject of most persistent rumors, of course. Early speculation was she suffered from some exotic malady which left her drawn and bedridden. These theories would repudiate by those few who would occasionally spy her from the street. In each case, she was seen exclusively at night, staring forlongingly through the second-story window of what was assumed to be her bedroom, lit only by candlelight from within, and to all appearances a picture of health. Additionally, there were little chance the typically damp and sunless climate of the wake would be prescribed to improve one's constitution by even the most inept physicians, as common folk are wont to do, with a logical explanation and from more fantastic theories are crafted. Some began to speculate the woman was a witch, with others an enslaved angel won by Wicker whilst dicing and dancing with Satan. What all who observed her agreed upon was her singular beauty. I gleaned much of this information from archives of the local paper, especially one curiosity piece which was accompanied by a photograph of the lady in question. The scene was just as I heard described, the single lonely prisoner peering through the window and across that terrible iron fence into the darkness of night. The photograph was muddled due to the quality of the prehistoric equipment and the lack of natural light, effectively obscuring the lady's features. It indeed was difficult to distinguish whether the blurred form was in fact human, though it did project an impression of unmistakable femininity. And yet, even though that grayish haze, I could perceive a certain piercing, almost hypnotic quality of her eyes. Wicker himself was something of a mystery, though considerably less so than his bride. A very attractive man, tall, dark hair, and well-featured. Many a young woman found herself undeniably jealous of that self, observed Lady Wicker. Though often away for long periods on business excursions, at home Wicker would frequent the only drinking establishment in the wake, an illicit locale consistently ignorant by the well-bribed police, forced charged with upholding prohibition. Although he had no one in town that might be explicitly named a friend. Wicker was known to purchase drinks for the house on his occasions of patronage, and was in such engaged in conversation by no few number of fellow revelers. It never took long for Wicker's tongue to be sufficiently loosened, at which time he would regale his latest vessel of hangers-on with fantastic stories of his journeys abroad. Forbidden hoodoo rites in the Caribbean, strange tribal sacrifices in the heart of Africa, dead men who deaths on the eve of Shaman in the year 1925 have gone down in history of Arthur Wake as embellished fact. Among the town records, I discovered the report of a patrolman dispatched to respond to disturbance at the Wicker House. The narrative was itself accompanied by the most gruesome of photographs. From the scene in question, I will summarize their contents directly. Thomas Wicker returned from his latest trip abroad the 31st of October. Having stopped briefly at home, he arrived at the aforementioned drinking establishment in a clearly agitated state. The always impeccably dressed Wicker was sloppy garbed, one shirt tail hanging out of his trousers, shoes scuffed beyond repair. It was obvious he had not recently bathed or shaved. His well-groomed hair was mussed, and his eyes were bloodshot and wild. Approaching the bar, he seized an entire bottle of liquor, took 2, 3, 4 long swallows without the use of a glass, and ignored all attempts of other patrons to engage him in conversation. Taking a final drink from the bottle, he placed his wallet and the entirety of its contents on the bar, smashed the now almost empty receptacle upon the ground, and exited with the astonished eyes of all present following him. That this entire portion of the episode occurred within a completely illegal establishment is not lost on me, although it apparently was on the investigating patrolmen. As I've said, they were well bribed. That no mortal eye remains which observed what happened next is surely proof of a merciful God. The 2 patrolmen who first came upon the scene were summoned by terrified reports of shrill cries and demonic cackles. Long-term veterans and hard men both, they were nevertheless ill prepared for what they soon found at the Wicker House. Armed with a lantern and gloves in hand, the men carefully approached the dwelling, now ominously quiet. The great iron gate was open askew, as was the oaken door at the top of the steps leading to the interior of the house. Receiving no response to the shouted inquiries, the patrolman cautiously entered the foyer and proceeded to search the ground floor. They found the first door in the kitchen. The maid had been tied with thick hemp rope to a large table, limbs spread and secured to each of the 4 legs. The woman was naked. The butcher's knife had been used to slit her throat permanently, sheathed in her heart. Glistening blood dripped from the cruel altar, slowly pooling on the floor, while telltale splatters painted the wall like macabre decoration. The patrolmen shared a glance of mutual unbelieving dread, tightening their grips upon their clubs, and continued to search the premises in complete and terrified silence. Having determined the cellular empty through a brief yet understandably taut examination, they exited at the back the door to the yard and discovered the groundsman's body. A thick wooden stake had been erected in the center of the garden, crossed by a particular beam. The man hung naked, suspended from the crossbeam by spikes harshly driven through his wrists and ankles in a grotesque simulacrum of Christ's crucifixion. He had been disemboweled, ropey and hurts, pouring out of his belly, dripping blood and excrement. sensing it was no longer a suitable dwelling place, fled the form of Thomas Wicker. The handsome features were gone, replaced by deeply sullen, sunken cheeks and a hideous grin. As a patrolman stared terrified, he could see the creature was covered in the blood of his victims left below. Hands about his knees, Wicker slowly rocketed, babbling to himself. Joined by his fellow, the constables steadily advanced, arms outstretched. They reached to seize the thing that had been Thomas Wicker when his mad eyes shifted upon them and he stopped muttering. In a moment of seemingly clarity, whispered, "She's gone," before emitting a maniacal howl and leaping to his feet. Taken aback, the patrolman hesitated, affording the lunatic room to bound past them to the window and hurl himself through the glass. His desperate shriek gave way to a sickening thud. The men rushed to the broken window far below. By the light of the room, they saw the body of Thomas Wicker, jerking spastically, impaled by the wicked spikes atop the iron wall. By the time the patrolman descended from the attic, the hideous motion had mercifully stopped. The remainder of the report is compared to the extraordinary events that had thus far taken place. Remarkably mundane, the house was searched after reinforcements were called in. Searched in detail, much speculation was made regarding the fantastic totems and fetishes populating every nook and cranny. All who set foot on the premises were in unanimous agreement that Thomas Wicker was unequivocally mad. Most confounding of all was no sign of what fate had befell the mysterious Lady Wicker. Taking the lunatic's final utterances related by the policeman, the investigators deducted that the lady, tired of being regularly abandoned, had fled his return. Upon his return, the shock had been enough to push the man into a murderous rage. Since virtually nothing was known of the woman, neither whence she came nor even her property, no search was mounted and the case dismissed. It is from this point that the tale departs from the realm of logical reasoning to instead delve into the twisted byways of urban legend. About a month after the death of Thomas Wicker, when the disappearances began, the investigation of which untimely led to my arrival in Arthur's wake. Parents would put their children to bed at night and find them gone in the morning. Exhausted efforts, exhausted searches of the wake, uncovering nothing. The strangers new to the town were accosted, imprisoned, and in one instance lynched by a frightened mob. Some questionable evidence, quote unquote, was found on the man's body after the fact, with the suspect too dead to proclaim his innocence. The police happily declared the case closed, that the pattern of disappearances has continued for more than 60 years, would suggest that they were mistaken. I have been unable to identify the first to claim seeing a strange light emitting from the long-abandoned window of Lady Wicker's bedchamber, nor the one whose horror he heard the sound of children playing as he hurriedly passed the accursed house. I do know that the tales have spread and grown to the point they are not so easily dismissed. Surely I will ascertain any truth to them that may be. I turn off the small audio recorder I've been speaking into and place it in my pocket as I make the turn onto the Blackwood Drive. Heaven only knows for whom I make these mind is a miraculous thing in its unabashed propensity to deceive itself, and yet I abide. Perhaps this will be the time my perseverance is at last rewarded with an